welcome to Intersections. We aspire here to help you dissolve boundaries, to be able to identify and access your highest potential by being always looking for opportunities through which to go beyond your sector, your domain, your identity, your profile into what vaster possibilities exist beyond. And today, I'm delighted that we will be taking on that conversation from a very unique lens. And that's the lens of sports. And in particular, within sports, Formula One racing. What do you and I have to do with Formula One racing? What is it that we can glean and learn and find common ground with the race car drivers who pursue that sport? We are going to be able to unpack that and much more with the beautiful contributions of Robbie Anderson. Robbie is a highly experienced performance psychologist and renowned attention expert, specializing in high-performing people, teams, and cultures. As an expert in applied neuroscience and high-stakes environments, Robbie has personally collaborated with the CHIMP model. We'll talk more about that. With the CHIMP model created by Professor Steve Peters for over a decade, co-founding and running a successful consultancy together called CHIMP Management. Robbie is now a director at Performing Minds, supporting elite performers in sports and business, and is the head of psychology at Hitendra Performance, consulting to drivers and teams in Formula One racing. I had an opportunity to get to be acquainted with Robbie's work through a beautiful article that came in the New York Times about exactly the kind of topic that we're grounding our conversation in today. What is it that you and I can learn from the mystique and magic of Formula One racing? And Robbie had some beautiful insights and thoughts which related so much to the kind of work that I've been aspiring and advancing in the world of business and leadership that I thought, my heavens, Robbie is somebody I want to get to know. And in doing so, why don't I allow you all as well, our dear listeners and our community, to get to know him as well. So what a joy to have you in our midst. Welcome, Robbie.
Thanks very much. Thanks for welcoming me on. It's really good to join and have some time together now.
Yeah, beautiful. So listen, I'm super intrigued, and so I'm going to ask you this question just off the gate, and then I want to come back and unpack a little bit sort of your journey in getting there. But just as sort of like one inquiry, you're working with these Formula One racers. I mean, when I think about them, naively in my own sort of very simplistic way, I think about, okay, I drive a car, and then these people really do that as a profession, and they take it to the ultimate limits, and they're even doing it in a way which is like, wow, so much on that edge where a slight little miscalculation or error can just be the difference between life and death, and so much more, not just winning and losing. In that context, you come in as a psychologist. What's the nature of that relationship between you and the driver? How open and receptive are they to having a professional, having Robbie come in and sort of like tell them, hey, listen, there are a few things about your own mind that I'm in a position to help support you and serve you and, open you up to. And if you did, that could make you so much better at that thing, which maybe I could never do, but I can help you take your game to the next level. I'm just curious, what opens them up to that kind of a collaboration with you?
Yeah, no, it's a really important question to consider, I think, from the two sides. One is as the practitioner going into work in these, I guess, privileged environments. And the other one is for anybody out there thinking, what would be the benefits of engaging, whether it's a psychologist or a therapist or a spiritual coach. So to answer your question directly, my experience of Formula One drivers has been, they are so driven, pun not intended there, they're so driven to fulfill themselves and obviously their ambitions when they explore all of the avenues that they can maximize. So whether that's a physical exploration of how to get the optimal neck strength so they can tolerate the G-force, whether it's nutrition and the right times to fuel themselves over a race weekend as huge demands on the body. Of course, it's going to leave quite an important area, which is, how do we look at decision-making, the ability to maximize your mind for handling pressure, even just for taking information on. And you start to multiply that by other factors, such as you become, I don't think celebrity is the word they would want, but obviously you become a person of profile. You're probably your own business in your own right, or a small team around you. But the demands on them become really quite significant. And therefore, as I said, when they're keen to explore all these areas of, let's just call it sports science, or the mind seems like a no-brainer. So that was my experience. They were very receptive. It was often that they came looking for the service. My relationship with Hitendra is that Hitendra is a very trusted and recognized sports science and medicine provider within that industry. And therefore, when they come to Hitendra, they might actually be looking for a whole package. but they might actually support the coach and some nutrition and some psychology. And that way they know that they're going to optimize their potential in their sport.
Hmm. And in working with them, have you found that there are certain practices and habits that clearly differentiate, those who rise to the top versus those who are good but not great? There's a whole body of work that was done by a few psychologists. Perhaps you're aware of that. Around the science of deliberate practice, for example, and who becomes world champion versus national champion but not world champion, or something like that. At that very rarefied level of high performance in the sport, are you able to differentiate those inputs that people are taking on as a determinant to the outputs of the performance, quite logically, or do you think it becomes a little bit sort of a random luck of the draw as well?
From my experience of this, you've probably got two things to consider. The first thing is, can we look at that person as an individual? Let's actually meet them as an individual. Let's assess, their strengths. Let's have a look at some of the areas they can already identify that they would need to improve. Maybe that's from feedback or from their own experiences. And then also there's kind of blind spots that maybe they just haven't had any awareness raised of areas they can explore and optimize. So it's very much individual first. I wouldn't say that every single Formula One driver approaches something in a set way and that's how the rest of the world should prepare. I hope you all agree, to generalize now. So very individual. The second layer of it is that when you look at their willingness, as I said, to engage, so actually looking at pre-race preparation, what's the optimal way to prepare pre-race, what kind of challenges are we having there, how do we optimize them in race, what's the best way. I mean, Formula One was unique for me coming into it as well, because in many of the other sports there's a bit more time than splits of a second, even on a rugby pitch or a football pitch or American football pitch, golf, there tends to be a little bit longer to apply these skills. But when you're going 200 miles an hour into a corner, battling somebody for position, the radio's in your ear, your steering wheel has 35 buttons, there's a lot to process to then apply mental skills. So you've got the pre-race, in race, but then also really important area is post-race. So when people come out of the car, are they able to engage really well with the team? Can they regulate the emotion of a race quick enough to actually remember it? Are they able to communicate that to an engineer and look at how they can change car performance? Are they then able to recover off the back of night one of a Grand Prix? So that post-race, again, is really, really important. And then the final one of the four that I look at is recharge, the ability to finish a Grand Prix in Melbourne, Australia, and then in a week later you're going to be in Japan, and you've got to do all that travel and all the preparation, but you still need to recharge. Now those four areas are where, if we can help that person optimize themselves, the opportunities are obviously very, very, very vast and are very, very, very unique. That everyone's going to have different strengths in different areas.
Yeah, I love that 4-part structure, and I'd love to actually spend a few minutes unpacking that with you. But let's kind of zoom out for a second and look at the arc of your own personal journey. What sort of led you to this place where this is the kind of work that you're doing? What drew you to sports? What drew you to Formula One racing and the underlying psychology of it?
Yeah, I mean, we're probably going well back into early stuff. So, I mean, I just love sport. Always was very, if you gave me a choice to be out on a sports pitch, chasing a football or throwing a javelin, then I would quite happily go and do that. Very sporty parents. So I think, again, there's a kind of maybe there's a role modeling, but also just social situation on holiday. If we're away and as a family, then we're probably having a tennis competition or something. So certainly grew up in a really sporty family and loved sport. Unfortunately, had some pretty awful run of luck in my later kind of late teens when I was playing very, very good level of rugby. I had multiple reconstructions of my knee. I had 3 reconstructions of my knee, which is, most people say 1's not great, 2 probably a career ender, 3 was early retirement. So I had this kind of pivotal moment. I had a moment where, I don't mean this as a sob story, just kind of matter of fact, it was a very difficult moment of life, because obviously my identity, my enjoyment, my ambition was all tied up in sport. And I thought to myself, I'm going to stay in sport. I knew I wanted to stay in sport, but I didn't really know what it was going to be. So I went to university to study a general degree in psychology, because I was very interested in it. And then I got interested in sports science whilst I was there. And then I just converged on this idea of sports psychology. I just liked the idea that I could apply all of the psychology social psychology, criminology, all of the good general psychology you learn when you practice psychology. But I found this niche that I thought I could apply it, and it related probably to some of my earlier kind of core. So even now, fast track, many, many years later, multiple sports and some really good privileges. I think now I still engage with people with the energy and enthusiasm of, that world. I still kind of see it as that. However, I also now recognize that when I go into a corporate world, as long as I can just slightly change my frame of reference, if you're working with a trader and their analysis of what could be a, good trade position or the risk, and, and then they get a team, and now they've got an economist helping them out, and then they've got a couple of other quantitative, and now there's this team and they're going to try and achieve this performance. I can buy into that as well. I can really relate to that as well. So I found, my core is probably something like adventure and curiosity, certainly a competitive drive in there. But then the professional side from the psychology over the year, I think also has just taught me I've obviously got to try and manage myself and be stable and be able to help people when they're in high pressure, turbulent environments. You see what I mean? I'm not there to be a fan. I'm not there to cheer and say, hey, this is Formula One. And the reason I've come to Formula One now was almost reverse engineered. And to be honest, it's come the other way. It's come to me. I've just worked in sport, stayed in sport, and then it's had this opportunity to work with some drivers, and it's just exponentially increased, really. So it's not like I always said, I'm going to go to Formula One as a fan. It's that I've just loved sport. And to be honest with you, probably my biggest passion is people.
Yeah. Great. Well, thank you for sharing that. I feel like you've given us a really great sort of, through your personal example, illustration of the forging a purpose in one's life, and how there are twists and turns and unpredictable things. And sometimes life deals a card to you that you're not really seeking or wanting, and yet you have to adapt to it. And who knows what new vistas and doors it opens for you. And so you mentioned the injuries and how they sort of limited your own pursuit of perhaps competitive sports as a professional path that maybe could have otherwise continued to be your path. And yet what it has led to is your ability to multiply the impact and performance of so many, in the sports world, beyond just what you may have delivered yourself. And then going beyond that as well. And in that beyond, just so that our listeners and I can understand the full range, what are the different kinds of profiles of professionals that you've been sort of finding to be, just the places where this psychology of pursuing excellence and high performance and the practices that you honed really apply very effectively and well? You mentioned trading a little bit.
It was a kind of a fortuitous point in my journey. I'd super early on. I'd kind of volunteered to go and do, workshops for an Olympic sport, and that had been well received. And then they offered me a, paid position. So I kind of, was going back the next year and delivering more. And then once the Olympics came around, I was quite embedded in this team. And once that Olympics finished, because you now was in Olympic sport, it kind of feels like you're in it and you've got a bit of credibility. There's an opportunity to move to another Olympic sport. Now, this second Olympic sport was a sport of taekwondo. And I knew very little about it. It wasn't a sport that I could practice a lot of. Goes back to your point earlier of, what can I teach a Formula One driver? At the end of the day, I've never even driven a Formula One car, but of course it's the convergence of the right stimulus, whether that's mindset or strategies, support, challenge. It's that stimulus that exponentially increases somebody. So I go to Taekwondo, and luckily for me, British Taekwondo is on this side of the road in Manchester, and British cycling is on the other side of the road in Manchester. You're like a stone's throw apart from each other. And at that time, Sir Dave Brailsford, who led the British Olympic cycling program from not the most successful program to certainly one of the most successful in British history, he'd got a psychiatrist. He'd got a forensic psychiatrist, and he was interested in what support the psychiatrist could offer to some riders. He'd had some riders sent. It was off-site, and they'd come back, and they seemed to be in a really good place. So that was the moment for me to meet this psychiatrist. We met at a service station, which was like a gas station in the UK, which was the only place we could arrange to meet. And we sat down, and straight away, he grilled me on my knowledge. It was like not very many airs and graces, kind of tell me about what you studied and what do you understand about the brain. And I remember kind of doing my best. And then they got out a napkin. That was the only thing we had to hand. Got out a napkin and we had a pen. And he drew his model of the brain. He said, right, you're right with this, and we simplified the brain. Now, when I sat, that was Professor Steve Peters, like you said earlier, the creator of the chimp model. When I sat there, two things happened. One is I thought, I can use this. Like I can use this myself. I can use this model. And the second thing was I thought this is going to be really helpful for my work. And since that moment with Steve, I think the journey, because of the success of the chimp model and the book, the people who came to the company were so diverse. The sectors that we were able to support were very, very diverse. So that for me was like a fast track of learning, but also of experience, because, the military would come, or sports sector would come, or, high performing businesses would come, general public would come. So that, I think, exponentially increased me, solid foundation, good support structure, and lots of exposure to different places. So I feel like I've probably worked with a good spread of society, really.
Yeah, fantastic. I'm reminded a little bit about a couple of folks we were speaking about, who also populate the same space. And I love the way sort of this work tends to show itself as so valuable and effective across domains. We talked about Owen Eastwood, Michael Gervais, both coming from the sports world, but also traversing these other professions. I'm also reminded of someone I've been a little bit out of touch with, but is a dear friend, Josh Waitzkin. Did you ever?
No. Please tell me more.
Yeah. Well, I'm gonna find a way to send you a copy of his book. His book is called The Art of Learning. And Josh was the U.S. junior chess champion when he was a teenager, and he almost became the world champion, except he was beaten by this Russian young boy, at that age. And then he left chess after being a little bit jaded, just by the competitive sort of like push towards wanting to just win. And so he takes a break, in life, and then he gets to be drawn to push hands Tai Chi. He ends up sort of in his 20s becoming good at push hands Tai Chi, ultimately going to Taiwan and becoming world champion in Tai Chi. And after that, he ends up sort of stepping back and analyzing the psychology of sort of what it takes to, create high performance, and then goes and works with a few hedge funds and in New York and all of that. And I think he's since then taken a break and is probably reinventing himself in some new direction, just knowing the kind of person he is. But it's so admirable, to see that capacity to pick up a skill set that can be used to accelerate and advance performance across so many different domains, because it kind of like almost is like the universe whispering to us that fundamentally we are all tapping into the same universal laws of human nature. There are some universal laws of human nature.
I agree. And that's not, that is absolutely not to say that there's some magic formula. It's not like, I have this cookie cutter, you send me anybody and we'll optimize their performance. That's, personally, that's not the way I've ever worked. But it does show you that if we can engage with people, if we can explore truly what they want, what is it they really want, they might not always know that. And then we have to explore that a little bit more. And then we can start to look at what it's going to take. And again, are they aware of that? Or do we have to help bring their awareness to a higher level on that? And then, of course, there's the supporting the person to be who they want to be type of objectives. And sometimes it's more doing what they want to do. And those two things also interlink. So there's these layers that you start to have in your head that you can explore with people, and it makes it very relevant to where they're at. Like the average person who listens to the podcast or is out there in the street today, they have an objective that they're trying to get done, whether it's that day or whether it's half a year or a couple of years. Everybody's going about it. Everyone's trying to progress in what's important to them, and to have a relationship with somebody that you can be honest about that, and then you can get some feedback and you can make some plans and you can start to build momentum. And again, sometimes have support that would improve anybody. It's like a no-brainer again, why the elite levels really go after that, why they embed psychologists in sports teams, why F1 drivers have their own psychologists. That's because, as we've just said, it would be helpful to anybody.
Yeah, beautiful. Well, we may or may not have the luxury of having a Robbie in our careers and in our lives, but you have it for today. You have Robbie here with you for today to our listeners, right? And so, Robbie, if you're open to it, can you give us a little bit of a glimpse as to what that set of practices is about? And I'm thinking maybe you mentioned this beautiful moment in the gas station with Professor Steve, right? So maybe you could start with that, like this chimp model. What is this chimp model, and how does it sort of give us an understanding about human behavior?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think Steve's work is out there in his book. So he's got the Chimp Paradox, which is his book, and would be a good starting place for anybody who wants a deeper dive than my quick overview now. But essentially, the Chimp model is an access model into our mind. So Steve's a psychiatrist, a consultant psychiatrist, a medical doctor, and studied really medicine and how the brain operates. And he was looking many years of research, from when the ability to functionally scan our brains was progressing, then our ability to really understand. I'm going to put a big caveat in there that we're still learning a lot. We absolutely don't understand the brain, by far the most complex system we've got, and we're learning a lot about it. But it was improving. We could see there was localization of certain behaviors. If you damaged certain parts of the brain, that it started to show up. For example, memory can be damaged in certain parts of the brain, and we can't remember certain episodic memories, or language can be, motor. So when Steve was looking at that, he started to think, okay, I can see these different systems, and he simplified it down in his working model to 3 systems. So many people will be familiar of the idea of having a strong emotional center from an evolutionary perspective, very instinctual, very impulsive, fight, flight, freeze. So we've really got this instinctual survival system. And Steve looked at the neuroscience and he realized that was actually quite similar as a system to what the actual chimpanzee possesses. And when we look at some of the behaviors of humans, let's say under stress, or when our primary drives, territory, whether that's physical or psychological, our food, if we are very hungry for periods of time, when we start to see people in that light, and we can all reflect when we're probably in chimp mode. We can probably recognize when our chimp is out. We can recognize how our thinking shifts, how our behavior shifts. If you take over somebody on the motorway and you do it very respectfully, but then there's a traffic jam, and you can kind of look around and you'll see quite a lot of what we might call the more chimp-driven behavior. There'll be some banging of the steering wheel and some kind of expletives going on. So without oversimplifying it, it's to recognize that within our brains is independent circuits that we don't control. We do not have direct control over the orbitofrontal cortex. It tends to go before our more rational, logical thinking. So it's almost pre-conscious thought. We're looking at body language. We're making assessments. We're hungry before we even know it. And then we just think, oh, I'm hungry. So the body and the brain are massively connected to keep us alive and keep our species alive. Secondary to that, if I was to put that in the middle of the brain, in the limbic and other areas, secondary to that, we've developed fantastic higher level functioning as a human being, our ability to reflect, our ability to plan, our ability to regulate. So often we'd ask people to get a piece of paper and just write down, who are you at your best? And people would write down who they are at their best. And that would be truly reflective coming from the higher circuits. So that would be as Steve called, the human circuits. That's you. That's the real you. And the biggest thing he would teach people is that you and the chimp realistically are best friends. Many people would see that as a rival, but you're not. The chimp has got an agenda, which is to keep you alive and to fulfill its drives. And it will keep offering you emotions and thoughts along that line. But it's your job to take care of it. And at times to say, yeah, we're worried about giving this speech to a large audience. And that's understandable from the perspective of the jungle, because there's high risk. We don't know who's out there. We could be attacked. But actually in this situation, I want to give this talk. It's more aligned with what I believe is important. It's a values-based talk to a school group. So all of a sudden, our chimp settles down because I've reassured it. So that was a great metaphor of Steve's model. Very simple, scientifically quite well grounded. But he had this third system, which was what really hit it for me in sport. His third system, he, again, metaphorically called a computer. And the idea that we can store, program experiences, memories, behaviors, patterns over our lifetime. So when I looked at sport, I started to think, well, what mode are people in to perform at their best? Which system do we really want to be in? And obviously for an athlete who might want to be very automatic, 100-meter sprint, for example, would probably want to be very computer, very automatic, not actually much analysis going on, not unnecessary distracting emotions. So a lot of that work would be to getting them into computer mode, getting into flow state, as is more commonly known. But actually in other scenarios, I'd want to be in human mode. I'd want to be reflecting, why isn't my season going well? And is this the right coach for me? And let's do an analysis. Let's interview some people. So you can start to shift between the three. And that was where I thought this will be powerful.
So when you describe these different sort of parts of the brain, it's sort of, I link it to something that I've been sort of modeling for leadership, which is to think about leadership and performance at work as a state, not a trait. In other words, it's not that some people have it, some don't have it, or you don't have it, you have to retrofit it and acquire it. But it's sort of like sometimes you enter that state, and when you're in that state, then you're in a position to bring goodness and creativity and courage and all of the good things that we need as a leader. And sometimes you're not in that state. So I'm kind of curious about seeing if you can relate to that idea of state versus trait.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, two things actually. One is, first and foremost, that the neuroscience, when we look at the neuroscience of the brain and how it's operating at certain points, it's very, very complex. But we can also see that too much emotion in key moments tends to increase error rate. When people are maybe over intense or over forcing something, we see high activation, but at the same time, we do see an increase of error rate. So at the same time, when we see people to be quite relaxed and get themselves, again, kind of topically called flow state, but they're there, they're very present, they're very task focused. We'll see lots of brain activity. It's not like the brain's turned off, but now we see a higher success rate. So what I'm always interested in is, how do we help people recognize what that state is like for them and get them into that state more often than not? And the neuroscience would seem to suggest that that's to do with which systems we're in and how we get good at shifting between them. So for me, it's to remind everybody that this ability to manage your mind is not a trait. That the myth that high performers are just wired differently, they were born with the ability to do these things really well. That's the myth. I see is people investing time into learning like mind models. They understand the mind and how it might react. They explore their own mind and they say, okay, what does my mind do under pressure situations? What are my triggers? What are my typical coping behaviors? And then they say, okay, what could I try new? Do I need to rethink that situation? Do I need to look at how I regulate emotion in the moment? Do I look at new habits that help me do that? A Formula One driver is managing their emotions, their decision-making, their relationships in this pressure cooker, but they're working on it. That they're proactively working on that with a feedback loop. So I completely agree with you. It is about getting in the right state, but I often think that's a skill, that people could work on.
Yeah. Wonderful. So, so you mentioned these four parts of the Formula One racer's journey, right? I'm trying to relate it to how we might sort of think about it for a leader, for an executive, for for any professional, right? And I think it sort of maps really well, right? So you talk about the pre-race, and that's before critical events that come up for a manager or a leader, for example, critical meetings, conversations, presentations, decision-making moments, what have you. So the pre part, then there's the actual race. So that's the moment you're in those interactions that you need to step your performance up to a good level for. Then you talk about the post-race, and then you talk about, I think you called it the recharging. Yeah, is that right? Yeah. So I like that. I mean, I think those four could easily apply to executive life as well. Is that how is that what you've seen as well in some of your work outside the car racing world? And I just want to kind of freeze the model first between us, and then if you could unpack what you see as winning practices in each of those, that would be great. But yeah, do you see this equally applying to other?
I really do. I really do. I think like I said, it's a simple framework, and also it's one that's realistically been around for a long time. If we think about plan, do, review, that's I don't know who owns that. I'd probably, be struggling now to find if that was one author that had that idea, but we'd go back and have a look. So I think that the simple premise is preparation.
Yeah.
But then obviously the level of preparation that people do for events can have a big indicator on success. So if you're a corporate professional and you've got a big project coming up, your ability to be really clear of what the goal is. So if you break down each one, so if you're preparing for it, what is the goal here? What are our focus points here? What are we trying to really achieve with this project or with this delivery or with this interaction? Then we might do some scenario planning. How could it play out? What are our options? If it's the board meeting, who's in the room and what typically do I need to, how do I engage with those people differently? What's the messaging? Right into kind of is my deck ready? And are my key messages ready? What resources do or don't we need? So I think that idea of pre is often about preparation and planning. Also, what we see in sport, and I think we do see it certainly in other domains, but to a higher level of popularity in sport, we see more simulation.
Right.
So in Formula One, they have simulator cars, basically a kind of interactive virtual reality. So we're familiar with virtual reality nowadays. You're sat in the car, the track is being fed into your brain, and you're maybe doing that track 50, 60, 70, 80 times with slightly different, I don't know, a wet condition put on or, different wind condition. So what you're doing is you're training your brain, you're simulating the experience. Now, visualization has been popular in sport for a long time as well, where we think about different situations on the pitch and how I'm going to respond to that. And therefore, I'm priming my brain, I'm priming the circuits which are more automated to kick in the moment. Yeah. So when you think about right from the goal into the scenarios, into the simulation and imagery, and then the last part for me, pre-phase, is probably around energy management.
Right.
So you've done your preparation, and it might be 2 days now before the delivery, and the work is done. I think in an Olympic world, if you're really trying to add any more preparation 2 days before you compete, that would suggest to me that really we should accept now. You've got more chance of injuring yourself than you have of finding the kind of miracle in 2 days. So now we need to manage the energy. And in Formula One, because the turnarounds are so tight, there comes a window where actually the best thing you can now do is down-regulate. The Formula One car is not sat on the track on a Wednesday with somebody revving its engine, burning its fuel and rubber. Yeah. So we can't do that with a driver. So some athletes 100% will believe that they prefer a hype approach to perform better. Don't talk to me from Wednesday to Saturday because I'm in game mode. And I am not here to say whether that's right or wrong. I'm saying some people like to do that. Somebody else will say, well, I just burn out doing that. I need to actually tune in at the key moment and tune out. So that is all still pre-phase. What do you think? Does that seem relevant to the corporate world as well?
I like very much the different components of that. And I think, everybody would say that they end up doing some preparation around the technical and functional aspect of the spreadsheet and the PowerPoint and the content of but then there is the human side to it as well, which I found sometimes that we are lacking in really thinking through in advance. What are the different opinions and reactions and sentiments that might get unleashed when I say this or say that, and what baggage is somebody bringing in, or what's my past history in that relationship, and therefore what's the right way for me to simulate an approach like this scenario, that scenario. So some of what you're saying, I think, is that stepping up to a new level of rigor. But certainly in some recent research I've done around this idea of sort of how do we get to accelerated performance in the workplace, I found that even just taking 10 minutes to do some of the preparation you're talking about, which is done in a much more rigorous way and more thorough way, and a time invested way in Formula One racing, from what you've said, but just even 10 minutes of a little bit of this in advance of the meeting, I found to be very helpful. Now, there's one practice that I found very, very useful in the business world. I'm curious about how you relate to it or not. And that is the setting of a positive intention. In other words, checking in with yourself that you're not approaching that, let's say that race, right? Or that meeting or that conversation from a place of nervousness or lack of confidence or a frustration or just some intention which can, at times just limit you from being able to see possibilities, seeing capacities, and being more joyfully and zestfully sort of involved in it, rather than, again, approach it from a place of jadedness or just kind of frustration or something. So, and now I imagine in Formula One racing, there's maybe that positive intention just comes from the passion people have for car racing anyway. But have you found it helpful to at times allow people to introspect a little bit? Like, what's your relationship with this particular race and, your past history with it, or the other players who are going to be there, racers, and anyway?
100% important, because of course, sport is another example whereby situations can emerge that would make the person feel a little bit limited. So, for example, you might be in a car and the performance of the car hasn't been as effective as you maybe desired. And therefore, if you're not careful, the brain starts to to fulfill that kind of narrative that we're in a limited car. And, if you're not careful, the most extreme would be like, what's the point? There's no driver or athlete that I've ever met that says, what's the point before they play? I think they're too highly driven for that because they're too competitive. But it does show you that ability to say, come on, what is this race weekend about then? If we're not racing for podium, what is it about? And they might say, right, it's about championship points. It's about finishing, sixth or fifth. Maybe it's about, right, I'm really going to push the car this weekend because we need to know its limits. The engineers need to find out. You're re-engaging them in that idea that the motivation becomes intrinsic again. It's their drive to learn, to push, to compete. And as long as they can reframe that, you're totally right. I think in sport, just like in business, where you think to yourself, right, I've had a rotten run of form. Things haven't gone my way. The last 3 projects have, proposals have been turned back. If you're not careful, the narrative comes, well, this is going to be the 4th. And that can obviously bleed into your demeanor and your delivery and therefore perhaps writes your success. But if you can get that chance to stop, maybe go back to really what you're about and you can reconnect with what you're about. And often most people will find some direction in their core. Who am I really? What is success really about for me in life? And in those questions, people tend to want to grow. They want to have a go, or they want to provide maybe for family. And they reconnect with that and they say, right, actually, do you know what? It's about me putting my hat in the ring and going again, it's dusting off. Let's go again. 4th time lucky with the board. So I think the parallels are there.
Yeah. Beautiful. I love the visualization, and scenarios. And it sounds like, of course, you have very advanced technology in the Formula One racing world. It's interesting because I've been working on building, a more humble version of that for the business world, which is by using AI to do rapid simulations of role plays, once you feed it in with like, here's the context, here are the stakeholders I'm meeting and here's what's at stake here. It just auto generates, different scenarios. What if this, what if this, what if this? And you respond to it and then it scores you, and tells you like, here's how I would actually, score how effective you are at empathizing or at pivoting to a new direction based on what you just heard or something. And so anyway, I see possibilities today, of being able to bring in some of that kind of discipline as well for those, if you want to call it corporate athletes, right, who are really keen and invested and wanting to up their game.
Oh, honestly, I mean, that sounds so interesting. I would love to see that because when we used to do Olympic preparation close, so you had your 4 years, you had a European Championships, World Championships, and and all these qualifiers, and eventually you're getting into the close. We'd always pick an optimal window where we'd have an Olympic simulation day. I say the optimal window because you want to do it near enough that it has a relevancy and obviously you're at peak form, but obviously you also don't want to get everybody injured. So the greatest challenge of simulation is making it realistic enough that your brain gives you the same possible stress responses that you have on the day. Those scenarios were always very good because we'd get people fighting against, other people who weren't selected. So there's that got a bit of rivalry. That was a great one in Taekwondo. But in the trading world, in the hedge fund world, you could also run simulation days, Now, what if you did enough priming around, maybe it was you'd get a senior, vice president or whatever in there just to observe. That was enough now that the traders in this scenario that we would put onto them, certain positions tanking and do you or don't you hold and how quickly can we get that information from London? The phone's down, you can't get that information. You could just layer it on. And whilst preparing that one scenario doesn't mean that you're bulletproof for everything, it does give you a chance to practice awareness, regulation, communication, a bit of ownership in following it up. And I feel that this opportunity to raise the bar a bit,
Yeah. I'm curious what your experience might reveal about the possibilities that are lying untapped right now, but that could get accelerated by some of these new tools and methods and disciplines we might bring into professional life, into business, etc. From the following vantage point, which is that I sometimes kind of draw the analogy with like a ball machine in tennis, throwing balls at you, right? That's the same thing with these simulations that you're talking about, right? And so it's constantly throwing you into various kinds of situations. And you have to practice your forehand or you have to practice your backhand. And that's how you develop muscle memory, and you become comfortable and good with it. And I'm assuming that that's kind of now being stored in in your model of the model of the brain might be in the computer part of the brain, right? Like all these lived experiences now are being stored, so you can access them at the right time. So the intrigue I have is, since this has never been done in leadership, communication, difficult conversations, inspiring people, motivating people, those kinds of capacities that we need, as a manager or leader, suddenly bringing this into the frame is going to unleash a whole wave of new capacities to humanity that we had just told ourselves, these people are not capable of, this or that. But it's not that they were not capable; they just hadn't gotten the right equipment.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to be. I'd love to be in thinking groups, working groups on the front of that. I mean, quite a number of years ago, there was questions around this. How can we take things digital? How can we make it accessible? How can we gamify? The idea of gamifying things and making it sticky, I think was a big movement. And now with the introduction of AI, I wouldn't want to limit it by suggesting right now where I think it's going to go. I think my experience of AI is you work with it and you explore each just together. I mean, some things that do jump out to me for sure is the ability to, as you said, interact with it, to give it challenges, and for it to offer you some solutions is already something that's going to be accessible to a lot of people. So perhaps not everybody can get access to a very, maybe it's exclusive or whatever, limited number of performance psychologists. But then there is information out there, and you can start to almost interact with AI a little bit and get some ideas. And how would I do that? And how could I do that in 2 minutes? And but give me another example. So I think the opportunity to interact is there. I love your idea of stimulus response training, that tennis ball machine, and the machine giving even us, the facilitators, we wouldn't necessarily be able to create what an AI can. So I quite like that. But at the same time, what I would temper that with is, if we look at the ability to stop at times and actually ground ourselves and to remember what's really important, and to make sure we've done that base level work, back to that core, like, who am I? What's important to me? Do I feel in control of that? The person is massively important in Formula One and every other performance sphere. The key people around them is massively important, in those relationships, and how we're getting the best out of that. And then often the team, so the wider team, the culture, the organism. So I'm sure AI and other resources can help us on all those three levels, but I feel sometimes that we always don't need to run before we're walking as well. Have we really pushed those three tiers, the person, the key relationships, the team, before we also go left field? And I don't think it's one or. I think we can do them both. Yeah, there's so much opportunity in the basics.
Yeah, no, I respect that very much. So thank you for also zooming out and helping us understand some of the other very core levers, and starting that with just your own self as well, grounding in yourself. Let's go maybe from the prep work to the actual race, right?
Sure.
What are some of these folks who are really at the cutting edge of performance? What are they doing differently? What are they doing well? What disciplines and practices do they take on during the race, which could be translatable into our lives as well?
There was a question that you asked previously of one of your previous guests. I was really wanting to listen in and just get a real good flavor. And just to stick to the question, it was about wisdom, and kind of exploring wisdom and how it can be developed. And I started thinking about that myself. And I thought, certainly for me, there's a bit about experiences there, about kind of taking past experiences. Then there's the reviewing part of actually extracting meaning from it. We all have loads of experiences, but we maybe don't stop to reflect on them. So actually stopping, reflecting, unpacking, learning. And then the third one, of course, is applying that. So you've had the experience, you've learned, but actually have you apply it in a way that means you actually improve future decisions. That's kind of wisdom, right? So I think that when I look at the drivers and many other high performing athletes, obviously drivers are just one cohort that's of interest here. But when you look at them during, it's their ability to do that assessment and to think, right, where am I succeeding and why is that and what's working for me? But also, where am I not? What is it? Is it my belief system? Do I have expectations that are triggering me in the car and I need to do that more belief-based work before I get in? I know we're talking about during, but at the end of the day, this is the work to better perform during. You need maybe need to have done the work for it. So have I done that assessment of what I need to be thinking, feeling, doing in the car so that I can be at my best? That then informs your routines, your refocusing strategies, how you communicate with your engineer, what communication do you need from them? How, again, do you regulate your emotion at certain key moments? What self-talk is in your head? If we've got a long race, probably easier to go outside of F1 here. Let's go to Tour de France, one of the most grueling cycling races in the world. You're going to ride your bike for near 21 days, well into the Alps, at altitude. You're going to hit levels of exhaustion, which really are commonly understood to be dangerous for the body. So your brain is going to be telling you to stop, right? It has to. The self-talk has to be, oh my God, we're going to blow. If we don't stop now, we're going to blow. What we see is that if you can train cyclists, even just amateur cyclists, helpful things to think, and they change that pre-planned thinking. Okay, when I get tired, this is what I'm going to think. I'm going to focus on the next 200 meters. I'm going to focus on just the rhythm of my feet, or I'm going to remind myself why I do this. They pre-program that thinking, that self-talk. Their success is higher. So all of these in-car techniques, routines, refocusing, communication, self-talk, I feel that they all come from the driver identifying where they need to change. Where's the opportunity for me to be better?
Amazing. I love that. So you plan in advance, and you, based on past experiences, you understand what your derailers are, you understand where you get off track, and you create different sort of if-then rules in your brain, the different sort of programming for how you're going to give a better response, when those situations happen, rather than the chimp response.
Perfect. Yeah. And obviously that sounds, for anyone kind of in the area or it's familiar, it sounds very cognitive behavioral. It sounds like, let's look at my beliefs, let's look at my behaviors, let's program them in, and we'll optimize all this performance. There tends to be a big relatability for that in sport, because it is quite clear, and it's kind of like, okay, that makes sense,
Yeah.
But obviously when we look at the neuroscience of it as well, we test people when they have a plan and they know what they're going to do. Of course, those circuits tend to run faster because they're rehearsed, they're stronger, they're myelinated than not having that. So we're almost now looking at how do we move away from default survival to more optimal. So it is cognitive, it is behavioral, but the actual strategies, regulation, acceptance, refocusing, they come from ancient practices. They're things that we've done for millennium in different cultures. In some ways, they show up now in very, very elite sport.
Yeah. Beautiful. You speak about intentional breaks that people need in their ability to hold their attention just constantly and consistently on one thing. Can you talk a little bit about sort of what that is?
Yeah, I think the way the brain is working is it's constantly scanning and taking multiple bits of information, and it's very, very efficient at cheating. It's very, very efficient at saying, we won't focus on that part, that's not important. It chunks it all down, and it makes it so that basically we can deal with the amount of stimulus that's coming into our brain. All right, so it's actually very super, super good, but it's cheating. When somebody says to you, oh, hey, did you not see John? He just waved to you there. No, I didn't see it. I didn't see it. If you could rewind every system, maybe I did see him, but he just wasn't in my frame of reference, right?
Yeah.
So often when we look at focusing, when people say, how do you focus for 2 hours in a race car with all this stimulation? Really, a key part of it is just learning to refocus. It's not that you're going to focus for 2 hours, right? It's that you're going to have to refocus multiple times. Now, that could be the same in a competitive football match. You might have an intention of how you're going to go out and be, but you might just say, hey, let's just do that for 10 minutes. Let's just focus on that for the first 10 minutes. And then after 10 minutes, I'm going to refocus. I'm almost going to go again and reset the brain. So the brain starts working in these more intentional, deliberate, chunked up ways. So there's the idea that to increase our focus, it can be helpful at times to almost intentionally break that cycle and refocus. But I also think from the New York Times perspective, I also meant the intentional break is around being deliberate with making sure you get your recovery. So it's actually more into that fourth area for me as well, because at the end of the day, there's a myth that, high performers are They just grind it out. They're non-stop. It's a relentless season. The season is relentless, but the truth is that recovery fuels performance. So at the end of the day, pushing harder isn't always the answer. Strategic recovery, actual deliberate breaks are what sustains elite performance. So that now works in the car, break that kind of pattern I'm in, let's refocus, but also let's break this cycle of like plan, do, review, fly, and let's just take some time out. Let's recharge. Let's go to the woods with my kids and just walk and turn my phone off. Let's just breathe. And, if necessary, let's get a bit of perspective on what's really important. I think that is also an intentional break for me, very deliberate.
Yeah, well, let's come back to the being in the flow of performance in the race itself. But since you brought up recharge, so earlier you had mentioned how you ultimately are there to be in service of every individual, who you're supporting. And, we're not all the same, and everyone has their own unique sort of things that make them tick. So am I sort of correct in applying that principle to this notion of recharge by suggesting that what you're saying is that everyone needs to recharge? That's like one of those universal laws of human nature. But the way you recharge you might find that needs to be customized for the individual, and that there might be the walk in nature for some of them, and for some of them it might be something else. Is that sort of how you approach it with your individual?
Yeah, if I were having the four areas and I was doing an assessment with the driver, obviously there's proper psychological assessment first, where I'm doing, history and presenting factors, and again, combining my training fundamentally as a psychologist then with performance elements. But I think once that's done, then we're now looking at performance, and we're in this 4-phase performance cycle. Every single phase has to be a needs assessment for that person. And you're right, therefore the tailoring is different. What I won't do is say, hey, look, in the car, the strategy you need to apply is self-talk, and you need to use positive affirmations. Now, one person might just say to me, you're absolutely kidding me, Robbie.
No.
Don't relate to that psychology. I find that it distracts me from the task. And actually what we're recognizing is this person's far more about maybe his instructional self-talk. They need to be reminded to, hey, you're overdriving at the minute. Settle back. Overdriving means, you're almost trying to push it too much. You're trying to find too much time, and you're not actually getting the best out of the car. So one person's self-talk that works for them might actually really, really not be relevant to the other person. And recharge is the exact same. And you're right. If I said to somebody the prescription is you have to go into the woods and be on your own, but they say, well, actually, no, I recharge from being with people. Ideally, my inner circle, who don't ask me a million questions about Formula One, but I like to be in a family unit, and, I like to be around a fire. You get me by fire and I feel that warmth. I just absorb the warmth. Somebody else might say, I want to go diving and I want to get under the water because it just reminds me how small I am. So that recharge phase is very, very individual.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Beautiful. When you talk about recharge, is that something like, what is the cadence that you have found to be really important for people to establish? Is it at one extreme, I think like once a year, or another extreme, it is once a day? So where, what is critical?
I think a lot of people out there are still asking the same question of themselves. They're probably still trying to work out that themselves. And I think there's levels that I try and explore with people, whereby recharge is also a similar process here as happiness, whereby if you wanted to recharge, you kind of look at, when am I going to do that? So you might say, okay, me and my family, we're going to have a vacation. And there was some research I read recently, which is 8 days is the optimal amount of time to be away, based on the kind of, by the time you get there and adjust, versus the time that then you're kind of a bit familiar with that environment. And it's, you kind of also want your home comforts to go back. So there's loads of stuff out there that will tell you where to go, when to go, and all the rest of it. But having that one time a year and thrashing me until then, I don't know if that's going to be enough for most people, right? People might say yes, but other people might say, no, I'm a double vacation person. Someone else might say, no, I'm about working 4 days a week and I have a 3-day weekend. So gets individual for what it looks like. The constraints happen when obviously you work in a sport where you don't have that freedom, where there's very set windows when you can take time off, and very high demand on you in between it. So I think for the Formula One drivers, we look at, how do you recover even within a race weekend? So from like stint 1 through practice to when you're going like maybe it's into qualification. How can you reset there? Is it that you get in your private room? Is it meditation? Do you go and get that a chance to escape and just downregulate the system? How do we then look between races? We haven't done it yet, but post-race number 3 is so important, because if you don't do it well, you'll probably never get to recharge. If you're always stuck in frustration or disappointment or questioning your performance, then that can carry on the whole week. And before you know it, you're racing again. Getting number 3 really good, where you debrief and you accept and you learn, it enables you to now go to your room and sleep or recharge. So I think there is micro recharging.
Yes.
There is more kind of, hey, at this moment in time, I can't wait to go and recharge. And I think this is the same with happiness, just to complete that point, whereby, sure, I'll be happy if I can achieve some of these goals in a year, but also just have 2 or 3 things, whether it's watching some comedy or speaking to an old friend, or, I need to be able to access that now, because otherwise holiday in June is a long way away.
Yeah. Okay, great. There are a few different things you've talked about right now, which I just very quickly love to sort of reflect on. So you spoke about positive self-talk, and you even used a word that I am very familiar with from the spiritual, sort of world, of affirmations. And I love that, because it's something that I feel we tremendously undervalue, in life. And yet it's like this free resource that any or all of us have to intentionally program our mind with certain words or phrases which are inspirational or directing us, towards the right sort of, end game in terms of our emotional state and our behavior. And I love that, it sounds like that's a really key part of the machinery that they're using in high performance sports.
Yeah, I think when you look at some of maybe the most popular spoken about, maybe it's because they are quite tangible. You can read a book, and obviously we'll talk about it now. I think sports psychology for a long time was recognized, or was believed to be, just the training of psychological skills. And there was probably like 5 of them, goal setting, self-talk, visualize, it was like classic nuts and bolts sports psychology. And then they realized there was a lot more going on in terms of the psychological. So I think self-talk is a classic. For me, it's not just about being positive. I think that's quite important. It is about being constructive. So it is about making sure that the inner narrative is constructive. Now, if we think about effective uses of that, as I said, it could be that you're quite instructional. So you're giving yourself something tactical. So if I'm a defender in rugby and I'm a bit worried about making these tackles because these guys are pretty big, I'm sure it's the same in American football. It might be that for a little while I just work on some, visual cues, but in my head I'm like, stay low, stay strong, stay low, stay strong, stay low, stay strong. And that narrative is just overriding any interference from, I'm not going to make the tackle, and what if I get rolled over? And, so I'm just deliberately saying, stay low, stay strong is very instructional and helpful for me. Somebody else might feel that actually they want it to be slightly more motivational. They might feel that actually, I saw some footage of Ronaldo, a footballer, and he's stood there before he does his free kick, and the lip readers have translated what he says, and he's saying, I've got this, I will score. I've got this, I will score. I cannot go and tell people I work with that that's the affirmation that they need to use, because some people will tell me, that doesn't help me, Robbie. It distracts me. It puts pressure on me. I don't want to try and predict the future. Yeah. So that motivational stuff, but I do think you can have a neutral one. I could stand over the ball or before the board meeting. Actually, I don't mind sharing this for the audience from my own experience, but I still get a really high adrenaline response when I'm going to talk to big audiences. And that adrenaline response for me would show up like, the classic heart rate, and maybe his hands are a bit sticky. Now, I've learned that I believe that is a healthy offer from my brain, just saying, hey, be careful. Are we sure about this? And now my self-talk would very much be around, okay, my heart's increasing, my body's ready.
Yeah. Beautiful. So that's that true self with the chimp and befriending the chimp and honoring,
Yeah, but I guess the key, what would be one of the messages there for people would be to stop and first and foremost become aware of some of your self-talk, to actually become aware of it. I would definitely ask some athletes to keep it. It's so hard to keep a journal when you're during a game and certainly in a car, but they'll come out and they can tell you critical moments and some of the thoughts. So I think number one for the population is to become aware of it and realize you've got a choice to change it. And then the second thing is to train it so that your inner voice is like a coach, not a
Yes.
critic.
Ah, beautiful, beautiful,
You know?
beautiful. Wow. It's incredible, right? The amount of possibilities we have in each of us to keep sculpting ourselves. And that's what you are. You're a master sculptor. You're a master
Well,
sculptor.
no, honestly, I'm just another person trying to do my best as well. And I love it when you get with somebody who's curious and they're interested and they want to explore it, and they bring you their thoughts once you get that relationship. And like I said, I can't read their mind. I don't know what they're thinking. But once you work with somebody who's open to the idea of exploring what they can try and do, now we can really have a go, And I feel that sometimes I don't have those answers. I 100% don't have them. I'll say to them, okay, let me have a think about this. Do you mind if I come back to you tomorrow? Somebody asked me the other day if I want to write a book, and I said, God, no, not yet. I said, like, maybe it's in a while. I said, I'm having too much fun cracking on for now.
Yeah. Well, sometimes I look at those of us who are at the cutting edge of practice, which is what I see you, doing for folks in the sports world and beyond. And I like to say, you're like the living scripture. There's some people who write the scriptures, study the scriptures, but you're like a living scripture. The book that you're writing is, the great outcomes, breakthroughs, performance that you're able to activate in everybody. And another metaphor that's coming to my mind is, because I talked about sculpting for a minute here, is Michelangelo. I don't know if you know, but like, so he would say sometimes that, to me, like, sculpting is just, the pure, beautiful form was already within the stone. And all I was doing was basically just chipping off the excess, stone to get to that beautiful form. And so I was visualizing you with all these sort of, coachees of yours, in their own sort of, high performing and super talented way, but you're helping them discover, their beautiful statue within, their true self, and, equipping them with the tools through which they can do a little bit of that chipping away. But you're not imposing. This is one thing I really am carrying from our conversation today. You're not imposing your view of what that statue is within them. You're helping them become aware of what their own, intuitive pull is towards their true self.
Yeah, that's a beautiful way of putting it. That's a really beautiful way. And I'd hope most people, I say most because I can't speak for everybody, but I hope most people in the coaching and the psychology space, once they do enough of it, I think they start to realize that that's the only way to do it. Because let me be fair. When you're obviously for obvious reasons early on, maybe it's in your career, it helps to have framework and to have structure, maybe to have a program. It helps because it gives you security, that I've got something I can go through. And then, of course, you just realize that, oh, yeah, but now I have to add this on, I have to add it. And it becomes so big that you think, God, I can't even have a framework. And then you feel more comfortable to move. But having things like a good assessment and a 4-phase performance model, or those 3 levels, the individual, key relationships, team, all these things that you can give so that the other person can see some direction. That's the balance, isn't it? You want to give them some ideas without telling them which way they're going, right?
Yeah. Beautiful. I sometimes, when wanting to express my gratitude and getting to meet somebody again and want to thank them, or just share my affection, I'll give them a gift. We all do. I'm not as good as I should be, but I try to see if I can bring that gift from India, because that makes me feel connected with these two worlds that have been so formative in my life, the East and the West, India and the United States. And so I want to give you a gift from India, Robbie, at the end of this, journey, this beautiful journey that you've taken us on. And we're in this virtual space, you and me. So I have to transmit it more through the digital world. And so it has to be a thought gift, it can't be like a material gift. But here's what I could, I think offer to you, which I think I think I can honestly say, has for me been a gift from India. And that is the following, which is, you describe this beautiful model, right? That Steve and you practice around the chimp model. And I really find that quite helpful. And I hope that many of our readers will take much from it, right? The emotional surges that sometimes we get, and that's the chimp part. If I understand you correct, there's the true self, the human self that can analyze and step back and reason and be rational and thoughtful about it. And then there's the computer, which is generating a lot of data, from all your experiences, and therefore allowing you to, from time to time, become wiser and smarter and more prepared, with every investment you make in building out this computer, right? Is that like a fair paraphrasing of?
Yeah.
So I want to propose and I want to add, and that's my gift from India, is like a fourth component to that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the fourth component I want to add is that your brain may also, you never know, right? And let's see what the science of tomorrow says. But your brain may also be a browser. Maybe it is a portal to some form of infinite wisdom in the universe. At some level, I first got that when I was hanging around in Botswana. We were doing some safari and it was beautiful, very inspiring. The flora and fauna and these majestic animals, the lions and the elephants. And ultimately, I converged on this like termite hill, these massive monuments to the hard work of at times 50, 60 generations of termites, who each die like within a year or so. But then after about 60 years, you get this massive mound, that they've produced. And I asked the guide there as to, tell me more. And there are these very intricate tunnels and almost like air conditioning and things they build inside them. And some of them are like soldier termites and some of them are like construction worker termites and all. And I was like, it blew my mind. That little tiny little insects, and I was just thinking like, wow, they don't have any sports academies. They don't have any, universities. These are just termites. But somehow they're born with the innate genius through which
Yeah.
to contribute generation by generation to the building of something that ultimately becomes a haven, for their community. And millions of termites are apparently then one of these, termite hills. Anyway, so this notion of, the brain as a browser and, it's a very kind of like a mystic, almost like a spiritual, like sort of model, of the brain. And I was thinking back to your world, and the person that came to mind is, I mean, I haven't had a huge foray in the Formula One racing world, but I did really love learning and studying Senna, this Brazilian car race driver who, died, painfully early through an accident, but also was an incredible world champion in that space. And he talked about how, driving for him, sometimes he would just get into the zone where he was in a different dimension and way over his limit, he says, and still able to find more, and I said, like, he said, like, I frightened me because I felt like I was, way beyond my conscious understanding. And I've seen that sort of like painters talk about it, like Picasso, that somebody else paints through me, or, Puccini in compositions of operas that, like, it's like, I just wield the pen, but somebody else is writing through me. And, anyway, so that's my intrigue that, you never know, but maybe what you're activating for some of these folks, if they're truly impassioned about it and putting the ego aside and just striving to be the best version, but also meeting the moment with these 1,000 variables, I can't imagine, how you're doing that without a little bit of almost like cosmic intelligence flowing through you.
I mean, the thing you've made me really reflect on there, and thanks for that. It is genuinely, one of the reasons, I don't know how other people feel about public speaking or podcasts or otherwise, but one of the reasons I 100% was happy to come on is I just knew we'd have a good conversation.
Yeah.
I was like keen to interact and learn. So already there's another thing you've given me right there. And what it's made me go off straight away in my head was that point about wisdom earlier. I think everyone has the capacity to develop some more wisdom, but obviously not everyone actually does it. And
Right.
for me, I think when I reflect on why that might be, one of the biggest barriers to that is rigidity. It is people who stick to their beliefs,
Right.
despite new evidence, who aren't willing to take some feedback or in this particular example, a suggestion.
Yeah.
So whereas we know on the other hand, people who embrace that kind of openness, who seek out different perspectives, who say, actually, how is this model not complete, and what else might we be missing? And wow, there's a whole other, right, let's go and explore that, and let's see how we can. Then I think that's where we accelerate our opportunity for growth. And yeah, for sure, I really welcome it. Genuinely, I'd be curious to look more into it. I think we don't just go through our experiences, right? The good performers, the top performers, don't just go through it, kind of actively extracting, adjusting, improving. So yeah, I really welcome that.
Oh, thank you. No, that's so gracious of you. So gracious. So as we then bring it to closure, first of all, thank you so much. This has been a real joy and exhilarating. I think exhilarating in many ways to stand, to walk in the shoes, some of your coachees, to feel that sense of complexity and competition, and yet sort of a co-creation that is happening between them on the inside and their world on the outside to unfold high performance. So thank you for everything you've shared with us today. To close it out, could you share what you're most aspiring for in life in the years ahead? What's your big dream?
Yeah, that's a lovely question. I think it goes straight the way back to me, to my kind of core, who I am and what I currently, I'm very clear that's important to me. I mean, I boiled myself at the moment down to 3 values, again, leaving that space to grow and adapt. But I think care is the big one of my primary, and I put my family at the top of that list. So I'm very fortunate enough to have a young, just under 2-year-old boy. So I see the next few years growing that and just following him on his journey and being a huge part of that with my wife. And so already there's that very kind of caring part. Then I think about that in the sport world and the people I'm working with and trying to help them actualize themselves and their dreams. So that's a big part. Ties hugely into my second core value, which is adventure. Adventure for me is an umbrella term for growth and trying new things. And it's a big world, or it's a small world, whichever way we look at it, So I think there's a lot of that in the next few years. Opportunities to meet new people, take on new challenges, experience new things. And then the third one for me would be, again, it's probably a simple one, but it's just to be happy in the simplest way. Be grateful for what I've got, stay grounded, be kind of, like I said, open-minded. So I think for me, that isn't a grand plan. There isn't a destination that I feel if I get there, then I'm done. I don't work in that way. I think it's just to be really here, enjoy it, have a bit of a guidance for those values, and make the most of it.
Beautiful. I love that. Care, adventure, and happiness. Wonderful. Wishing you all the best, Robbie, in your journey ahead. I sense that there are many luminous chapters still to be written, and that even perhaps you may have an inkling, but not really a tangible form yet that you've given it as to what those might be. So truly, I think life for you is going to be an adventure full of a lot of pathways to happiness. And, and I'm so grateful that caring is such a core part of what it is that you're aspiring for as well, because in the kinds of times we live in today, when you talk about rigidity and the need for self-renewal, I think care would be, another of those great values, that we can take some inspiration, from you having sort of ended our podcast with that. So thank you.